Hi, my name is Claudia and you are listening to the podcast Architektura Powinna. Today I'm talking with Dick van Gameren.
Well, what I like to say to students also, to provoke them a little bit, that it's much easier to design a museum than good housing. But I absolutely believe in that.
Dick van Gameren is Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at TU Delft in the Netherlands. He's a professor of architecture and dwelling. He's also an architect and partner at Mecanoo. He has an impressive range of projects in his portfolio, including residential design, large-scale town planning, laboratory, education and healthcare projects. At TU Delft, he leads an international education and research that focuses on the problems of building affordable housing in rapidly expanding cities across Africa and Asia. He's the founding editor of the book series Dash, Delft Architectural Studies on Housing, and it's definitely worth mentioning that in 2007 he received an Aga Khan Award and in 2012 the Best Building of the Year award of the Dutch Association of Architects. In this conversation we take a look inside TU Delft. We discussed main goals and approach of the school, but the main architectural topic is housing design. I'm asking Dick about the current housing crisis. What are the circumstances of this shortage and what can be beneficial for it? How can we provide high-quality, long-term housing solutions? I was very curious what is his opinion on building artificial islands, densifying the cities, or building in Dutch open land. How can we learn from the past and what are the valuable traditional patterns in housing design that we should be conscious about? Today I'm talking to Dick van Gameren, Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and Built Environment at TU Delft, Professor of Housing Design and architect and partner at the Delft-based office Mecanoo. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Very happy to be able to talk live at the Faculty of TU Delft. I mentioned 3 quite important roles of yours, of your professional career. So before going to the topics that I've prepared, could you explain a bit more what's your current area of focus? Is it more school, being architect partner at Mecanoo, teaching the housing design? What's the current area of focus? It's a lot.
That's a good question. But no, I think since a bit more than 4 years, my main focus is on being or trying to be the dean of this faculty of architecture here in Delft, which is more or less a full-time job. So my activities in practice I had to reduce them to really a minimum. It's just when I cycle from my house to the faculty, I pass the office of Mecanoo, so I step in now and then, but that's it. I still do some teaching, but that also is much less than it used to be, although it's still one of my, I think one of the things I like most doing, working with students. Fortunately, this spring I had the opportunity to take leave for 3 months from Delft, and I was teaching then as a guest professor in the United States at Harvard, and then I again experienced how great it is, to teach, to work with students, to share your experience and knowledge and see with how students develop their own position and come with their own ideas. I think one of the most inspiring things.
And I'm curious also about those differences. I mean, you mentioned Harvard, and of course, American and European architecture has quite different history, in many cases different approaches. Do you also notice it at the faculties in education? Is there a gigantic difference, or if you compare the student approaches, you can find a lot of similarities?
I think in the students, how they approach it, what their ambitions are, I see a lot of similarities. But I think, let's say, architecture culture, design culture can really be different from place to place or continent to continent. Yeah, just to mention one thing, I think here in Delft you could say it's maybe pragmatic, but we have a very, let's say, quite direct approach to the profession. It's really about also how to build, to really work on actual the big challenges. And what I saw in Harvard, the architecture students, but maybe because the architecture culture in the United States is very different, it's also much more difficult there to really get a practice started and getting larger commissions. So I think there it's much more an intellectual exercise, architectural design at schools. And I think here in Europe, what I experienced, at least here in Delft, but also what I saw when I was teaching, doing workshops in Poland, is a more geared really to
feasibility, more technical aspects.
Feasibility, exactly, and to make projects on a larger scale.
And beside these technical aspects, like how would you describe the urban architectural approach of TU Delft for somebody, maybe for some listeners that are thinking about studying at TU Delft, maybe for somebody that it's not necessarily a designer but might be in the future? Like what makes the TU Delft and the Faculty of Architecture different or special?
Yeah, well, we like to think here in Delft that indeed we have a certain specific approach to design, and I think that focuses very much on urban design, because in many parts of the world you see really a distinction between planning, urbanism, and architecture, and that other aspect on the larger scale, landscape design. And I think what is quite specific for how we work in Delft or teach here at the faculty, but also how work in practice has been developed over time in the Netherlands, that it's always about bringing the different skills together. And for us, let's say, planning and urbanism is never a kind of abstract enterprise, but always directly related also really to urban design and to architecture, that we always bring it together. An extreme example is I've been doing work in India and Africa, but I think even you could say that about the Americas, that often, let's say, urbanism is restricted to a kind of planning, zoning, where it's all about the FSI, how much square meters can you make on a certain plot, and that is, let's say, the urban plan. And I think we do that really different. We immediately connected to design and start developing also the building envelope and how one development relates to the other one. To have this kind of integral approach in the different scales, I think that's the crucial starting point for the way we educate our students in thinking about design and planning.
And I can imagine that's also a great preparation for their future and the professional experience. But what is often said is that the studies don't necessarily prepare students for a real architectural world, that it's there for the market, for the budget-driven projects, for a lot of frustrations. And maybe these frustrations are caused by the studies. But the question is, like, should school prepare for the professional experience, or the purpose is slightly different?
I would say it's really different, not even slightly. I don't think, let's say, our education should be a kind of imitation of practice. I think architecture is something, and design, it's time consuming. And you need to build up experience over the years, and you can't build or gain all that experience in a 5-year program. So I think what we as an educational institute, as a university, should bring to our students is that we help them to develop their own position, to become clear about their own ambitions, and to have to develop a way of critical thinking about design, architecture, urban planning. And I think that's the starting point. And from that, you move into practice. And then you see there are a lot of other things that are also part of the profession. And you will learn that over time. But I think the important thing is what we can do is here to have that start with that you become a critical thinker, that you can think in alternatives, and that architecture is also a research activity. And it's not just, there's a client, he wants this, and you do what the client wants. Of course, you have to do what the client wants, but you also have to bring in your own ideas and position. And that's what we can learn the students.
You also graduated from TU Delft. You started your studies in early 80s. If you would have to compare the architectural atmosphere back then and today, how big of a program change is there? What would be the common ground, and what are the most important changes in a school program? Is it completely different because the times changed?
I don't think it's that completely different when I compare it to my own years of study in the 1980s. Indeed, as you say, it's a long time ago. I'm getting old. But you see things changing, but also things coming back. When I was studying in the 1980s, I think that was a period that architecture had almost disappeared. It was also, economically speaking, a difficult period with a lot of unemployment in the Netherlands and I think all over Europe. And architecture, there was a strong focus on urban regeneration because, let's say, the period of the large-scale new housing estates, was gone. And there was a strong focus on working in existing neighborhoods, in processes of participation, restructuring, rebuilding, or renovating the existing older parts of the cities that were often in a very bad state in the 70s and 80s. But in that period also it seems that the idea of architecture as also a kind of design discipline was more or less lost. It was very much about, making things affordable, as I said, participation. Not bad at all. And you could see in the 80s that architecture also as a design discipline with its own ideas and foundation was rediscovered. I think that was also the start of what in the 90s was called this Dutch supermodern, that we were also looking back at the heroic period, as we called it then. I don't know if we still call it heroic, of the 1920s and 30s, when modernist architecture developed its own language. And I think designers also, well-known practices that became really well-known afterwards. Also, the first projects of OMA and Rem Koolhaas, but Mecanoo, where I did an internship, they brought back also this kind of aesthetic language that was lost.
The freedom in design, I think, in a way.
Yeah. And then in the 1990s, and I think I was lucky to have studied in the 80s because the 90s was really, I would say, a new golden age for architecture.
Yeah, it turned out pretty nice. It was a risk to start studying architecture in the 80s because there were rather poor times.
Yeah.
But then
so it's
90s.
Always good to think in cycles. So if the prospects are bad, I think you should start studying architecture because then 7 or 8 years later, it will probably be very different. And of course, things changed. So the 90s were really a golden period where also, let's say, the government really stimulated architectural culture. They had programs of grants. And for example, the project that we were able to do, we were selected for to build a new embassy building in Ethiopia. I was really part of that program to give young architects chances to create projects that could showcase Dutch architecture culture abroad. That was quite amazing. It's still quite exceptional. But it also changed because in the 20 years later, this whole idea of stimulating architecture culture was gone. And then we had the credit crisis and architects, again, Yeah.
2008?
Yeah. Around 2010, 12, half of the jobs in architectural offices were lost. And then we climbed back again. And now we're again at a point where we have to see what will happen in the coming years.
We are talking in the Netherlands a lot about the housing shortage, housing crisis, and you've been engaged in housing design for the past 20, 25 years through your practice and research and teaching at the TU Delft. You've been also involved in many projects around the world, basically, not only the Netherlands. You've built a lot of projects in England. So based on that international experience, and adding a quote from your book that Dutch housing has quite a good reputation worldwide, especially in the last 100 years, thanks to architects as Hendrik Berlage, Michael de Klerk, Gerrit Rietveld, Jaap Bakema, but also due to politicians, housing corporations that understood the importance of good and affordable housing. That was the last 100 years. But how would you refer this good reputation to the current housing crisis?
Yeah, I think regrettably, sadly, it has changed because also the Netherlands didn't escape the neoliberal, let's say, wind or storm that came from the West, from England, from the United States, and let's say went over the world as a whole. So the position of housing corporations has been greatly diminished here in the Netherlands. Commercial developers became the dominant force in housing construction. And I think that didn't help, let's say, to keep up that tradition of good and especially affordable housing design. It's quite amazing. I think there are few places in the world where you can see that in Amsterdam, till 20 years ago, half of the housing stock was social housing. Now it's still like 40%, so it's a bit lost, but there's still a lot of social housing.
Yes, but to get them, the waiting list, they say in Amsterdam is 18 years.
Yeah, that's another discussion, of course, and that's a very political thing as well.
Yeah, that's true.
If you would say that people who really, let's say, in the end have now an income that is far above the cap that is used for social housing, they should move out. But that doesn't happen. Of course, why would you move out of an affordable house in Amsterdam while if you have to go to the market, it's extremely expensive? So, of course, there are big problems connected to that. But still, it's a very large percentage of the housing stock is affordable.
Yeah.
But it's simply not available to newcomers. That's the issue.
But is it more of a like social, political, or architectural issue then?
I think it's a political issue. What you can certainly see also in the last 20 years, of course, there's still also some social housing being built, especially now because it's also a political thing that in cities like Amsterdam, 40% of new housing developments have to be social housing. And as a designer, I've always experienced that there's no difference between designing, almost no difference between designing social housing or housing for the commercial market. A nice example is a project I worked on for quite a few years during a development, a Funen Park in Amsterdam, which is considered quite a successful project, which really mixes all different categories from social housing to really expensive townhouses, there are small apartments in the project. It's a master plan of Frits van Dongen and very substantial townhouses, as I said. I designed there the social housing buildings. And then during the development, the developer decided to put the projects I designed as social housing to put them up for sale. Mm-hmm. And then he selected some other projects that were designed as commercial market housing to sell them to the housing corporation to put them on the rental social housing market. But we didn't change anything in the design.
So you mean that the flexible design
there's
paid
not
off?
really a difference in the standard, both in terms of, let's say, quantitative and qualitative. I think we lost that a bit now, because now the market has developed in such a crazy way in a city like Amsterdam that the value of the market value of houses is so enormous that has risen so much that you see several things that that units have become very small. It's also quite ironic, because in the 90s we were demolishing a lot of post-war housing because we thought it was too small and not up to today's standards anymore. And now what we are building on average is smaller than the units we were demolishing in the 90s.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to mention that the housing shortage is not a new problem, not a new crisis.
I always say it's not a crisis. It's always there. There's always a shortage, especially a shortage of affordable housing. But it has become more extreme. It's the same in London or other large cities here in Europe, but everywhere. I experienced that in the United States, but also in big cities in India, in a place like Mumbai. It's everywhere. It's the same issue.
If you would have to name it, what might be the city tools, municipal tools, and the architectural tools that can be beneficial for this shortage?
That's, of course, a very good question, because if we knew the answer, maybe we would now be really addressing or even solving the issue, which we are not. We have a big project going on in our faculty, especially also with researchers from the real estate and management department. How can we find answers to deal with this issue, the shortage of housing, of affordable housing? And there's a lot of discussion here. I think in the end the answer is there's not one answer. And I think that's also something that we can learn from the past, when people were looking for one answer, and then you find, let's say, one way of solving it, and you build a lot of that one solution. But then after 20 years you see that maybe that's not a very, let's say, it was not a good answer, because we've seen that in the post-war neighborhoods that were built in the 50s and 60s. Everything is the same.
The mass prefabricated housing
So
blocks.
if you build too much of the same, and if neighborhoods are really, let's say, have just, in a way, one kind of housing, then after 20 or 30 years, when people have different ambitions, different desires in their housing environment, it's very difficult to adapt to that, because people can't find anymore what they want in the neighborhood where they live. They might want to stay there, but because they're getting older, they want something else, or maybe they have more income, so they want something larger, but it's not there, so they move out. So that was the problem of these post-war neighborhoods, that in the end everything was the same, and people had different ambitions, and they moved out because they could not find a new place in their neighborhood. So I think what we can learn, what we have to do, is build in a much more mixed way in different housing, in finance categories, but also different housing typologies, and not try to solve the issue now with only building prefabricated small units of 50 square meters. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's only a short-term solution. That's what I think is really the danger, because there is a huge demand, so we go for short-term solutions. What is quite interesting is that we again have a Ministry of Housing that was dissolved years ago because, politicians thought, especially, of course, the right-wing and more conservative politicians, the market will take care of housing issues. We don't need to steer that anymore top-down. Mm-hmm. Well, now we see that approach doesn't work. So again, there's a Ministry of Housing, and the Minister of Housing said, okay, I want to give an impulse. And they bought 2,000 prefab units, and they said to the Dutch cities, municipalities, okay, we have them ready, do you want them? Until now, there's only one city remarkably it's Delft, that asked for 200 of these units. And the other ones are still there. They're not being used because... And I think, in a way, I quite like that because I don't believe the solution is there. It's a kind of emergency housing and it can work, but it's not, let's say, a solution that's future-proof. And we need solutions that are also working on the long term, that are future-proof. I think that is what we should learn from the past and that we really have to take into account now. So there's not a single solution. And okay, this prefab housing, but it's not the only solution. And we have to also to work on other ways. It's the same with the discussion, should we build in the existing city? Which I think in the end is what we should do. Because
densifying
to keep
the cities,
the existing open space that we still have open. And I think there's still a lot of literally space in existing cities, especially in post-war housing neighborhoods, to add housing, to make them more mixed, also to give them a new life. But on the other hand, and they're also here, colleagues, professors who argue that will take too much time, it's too costly, it's too complex, so we should again build in the open land and roll out all these standard terraced houses that we know so well in the Netherlands.
Yeah, sometimes it is also said that this open space, open green space of the post-war prefabricated houses, that's almost the only quality that you get in these houses.
And you should not, of course, take that all away. It is a quality. But we see that in the Netherlands. I did a lot of work in these post-war neighborhoods when I was still very active in my own practice. And indeed, let's say the structure of the open space, the green spaces, the water, the canals, they are in a way what's most valuable of these post-war neighborhoods. And because that's such a strong framework, it's also quite easy to replace existing buildings because maybe they are after 50 years at the end of their lifespan. And of course that happened a lot. Now the focus is because and I think that's also a good development, less in demolition but more in renovation and more radical renovation of the existing. But I think that can go hand in hand with a certain densification of these areas without destroying that main green structure. I think that's a very important, let's say, direction, not the only one, but certainly a direction to look into, how can we address the housing crisis. Yeah, and maybe we now and then also still have to build a bit on open land. But I think we can even look to the neighborhoods that we built in the last 30 years, the so-called, what we call in the Netherlands, the Phoenix areas, large extensions at the edge of the main cities, mainly built with just one type, the typical Dutch narrow terraced house. Yeah. But also there, we should try to make it more differentiated at other housing typologies, also to prevent them from a future similar to those of the 50s and 60s post-war neighborhoods that in the end people abandon them.
No, that is interesting what you're saying in terms of that it's not such a black and white problem and there is no such a straightforward one solution, especially when we are talking about long-term future-proof a solution for the cities, that it really depends. And I guess the densification in many cities makes sense, especially if we compare the density of Dutch cities in comparison with even London or some, not mentioning Asian cities, of course. Yeah. That's another extreme example. But then I've read you were also involved in the studies on artificial islands in Amsterdam, like Eiburg. Is the creating new land and interesting a right direction, a good solution?
Yeah, it's one of the solutions, and I think indeed you can probably say that this Eiburg development of Amsterdam is quite successful. It was very contested because, of course, well, certainly as we are more and more confronted with the effects of the climate change, but let's say how we deal with water really asks for more radical approaches than we have done in the past centuries.
Even more radical.
It's more difficult. I mean, you have to be very careful because we now know that water also needs space. So taking away space that used to be water and turn it into land, you have to be very careful. But you can still do it. But it's an interesting question. I'm also involved here at the faculty with study projects, research, but also student projects, where we look at another huge delta in the world. We are here in the Dutch delta, but the delta of Bangladesh. And there you can also see that there's a lot of, because it's also an exploding, urbanizing country, much denser even than the Netherlands, although we always think we are the most densely populated country in the world. That's not true. But there's a lot there also of illegal landfill, land reclamation that leads to huge problems because there's no space anymore for the water. But still, we have to find good ways of building in or on the water or making land on the water. It's certainly a solution because we see worldwide, it's not just a Dutch thing, that the largest concentrations of people are in deltas.
But I'm curious how you place it in the discussion of the biodiversity and climate changes and so on. Like the artificial land is a huge degradation of the biodiversity in many cases. We say that the new island is gonna have the most sustainable ecological new houses and we're gonna design it with the latest assumptions, but to create the land itself, that's already a big ecological impact.
Yeah, and that's why I say you have to be careful. You have to really think what will be the effects of creating a new land. With Eiburg, that's a very interesting history. There was a lot of opposition against doing this, especially from groups that were advocating nature preservation. And then, and again, but that's maybe typical Dutch, we call it the polder model. In the end, you have to find a compromise. And it was found by promoting, let's say, biodiversity in other parts of the country. So you could say, okay, there's no place for certain birds and other animals anymore in the water, but then you can make other parts that are still water more attractive for them by making them more shallow or adding other. I think we have, of course, a very strong tradition in the Netherlands, and we're famous for that we create our own land. We also create our own nature. Nature in the Netherlands is man-made. So you can compensate, turn water into land. You can find ways to compensate the natural values somewhere else. It's always contested. What was in the news last week is that along the Dutch coast, they want to kill, let's use that word, 14,000 trees in a certain area. And there's a lot of opposition against that. Why is that initiative taken by the state organization that takes care of the dunes? They say because the trees are not natural. They were planted in the 19th century to prevent the sand from being blown away into agricultural land. Mm-hmm. So all these evergreen trees, they are not natural here in the Netherlands. They don't belong here. But now people think, okay, it's our forest, we should protect it. But what let's say what the experts say, no, it doesn't belong here and it affects biodiversity. We have to take them out because then the original nature can come back, which is much more diverse instead of just these, rather monotonous, quite bare forests of fir trees. That belongs to the mountains or to Scandinavia, but not to the Netherlands. It's very interesting. Yeah. So you see how, these things turn into a conflict. But that it's too easy also to say, you destroy nature, because often what we destroy is something we made ourselves.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned in the beginning the critical thinking and questioning things. That's also good to keep that approach indeed. And are there areas or districts in Dutch cities or cities itself that you would highlight here as an interesting response for such developments? For example, readjusting the post-industrial areas. That's also what's happening in Rotterdam, in Amsterdam, even with, in many cases, with polluted soil and ground that first has to be also reinvented or cleaned. Is this also the way to help with the densifying the cities?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the other main directions we have to follow. We discussed, let's say, densification, renewal, diversification of existing housing neighborhoods. But certainly, let's say, old industrial areas that are also, let's say, becoming out of date or underused, yeah, they should be turned also into more mixed areas. And you see it happening everywhere in The Hague and Rotterdam and Amsterdam. Amsterdam, to stay to that city as an example, has the ambition to turn the Sloterdijk area, which is a 1950s, 1960s, a bit of an older industrial area, to turn that also in a mixed area, creating there at least 40,000 new residential units. It takes a long time. These are difficult processes, but yeah, I think it needs to happen and it will happen.
Yeah, and there is always this huge risk or gentrification when it comes to redeveloping, renewing, adding new values to suburbs, to post-industrial areas.
Yeah, and that's, I think, again, something that politicians have to address. And I think to stay in Amsterdam, that with that rule that of new housing developments, 40%, 40, not 1-4, but 40 has to be social housing. The next 40% has to be, what they call mid-category. It's still relatively expensive, but there are a lot of restrictions. And then only 20% is left completely free, which is, I think, also quite amazing, but I think that will definitely help to address this issue of or possible danger of gentrification, because we indeed should avoid that. What is important then is that you don't say, okay, we put all the social housing in one neighborhood and all the more expensive housing in the other. I think the idea of mixing is crucial. I mentioned the example of the Funenpark project, which is also a brownfield development, an old industrial area very close to the historic center of Amsterdam. By really mixing on a small scale, you can prevent gentrification. And I think that's absolutely crucial that we do that.
You say frequently that the architecture of housing today still appears to be closely linked to traditional patterns in terms of like space and material, and you really highlight a lot that the housing is not about trying new designs constantly, but building upon experience. Is the mixed communities coming from the history, or it's actually it stays in opposition?
Yeah, you can see, certainly if you look worldwide, I think fortunately in the Netherlands we still have a kind of tradition of mixing. Although you could say that the post-war neighborhoods that were like 90% social housing, created by that, let's say, monoculture of social housing problems after 20, 30, 40 years. And that older areas of the city where it's more mixed, are much more, let's say, successful over time. And of course, we have many examples where there's really a strong distinction, where you see a certain ghettoization of cities, that you get poor enclaves and rich enclaves that don't connect. And that's something that we need to avoid. And I think in the Netherlands, we manage that also with the large regeneration programs of these post-war social housing districts. which was also contested, obviously, but where social housing was replaced with market housing, either just replacing or by a process of densification, that really, I think, was quite successful. And if you don't do that, these areas can become kind of enclaves of people with little means, which leads to a continuous downfall of these areas, because then there's no, shops have no existence anymore, and so also the amenities, the services in an area start to disappear. So it's really sliding down. It's something that you see in other larger cities outside the Netherlands. And it was also really a political decision to create that more differentiation in housing categories in these post-war neighborhoods, to prevent things happening, what was happening already in the 90s, for example, in the outskirts of Paris, the banlieue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Looking at the current housing projects that we developed and we built in the Netherlands, how do you judge the current condition of the housing design? Does the design reflect the times that we are living in? And if yes, then what does it say about current times?
Well, there are several things to say about it. I think we are in a period of transition. I expect that housing design will really change in a more drastic way in the coming period, because also all new rules that are being implemented about being energy neutral. A housing project has to harvest its own energy. That really means something for the design of a project. But we're still not there. We still don't really know yet how to do it. The material that can be applied will change. We are already talking about concrete shame. We know that concrete is one of the big polluters when being produced. It contributes a lot to CO2 production. So the focus is very much on wood. Amsterdam signed a contract with developers that within 4 years, and I think they're now halfway, like 20% of building production has to be in wood. I'm not sure if it's going to happen, but it shows that things are really changing. And I think also designing with wood, designing housing in wood structures, has its new restrictions, but also new possibilities. I think now it's still being designed as if it's concrete. We have to make that shift in a different way of designing. So there are a lot of, let's say, impulses, necessities that I think will really change the way we design housing, but we're not there yet. That's up to the new generation.
The ambition is there.
Yeah.
But feasibility still, it's usually
and what
an
you
exception.
see now is that again, there's this danger of that we now address the housing crisis with too much of the same, prefabricated small units. With only that, you can't build a city. So, we need to look for other solutions as well.
You mean that there is a risk to repeat the mistake we already made in the past?
Then we build now housing that in 30 years we think, what's the future of it?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to go back to the traditional patterns that you frequently mention about the space and the material. Where shall we look for those links and patterns? Is it more in the, let's say, Dutch way of housing design, if there is one, but frequently we mention that it's the sort of cluster way of placing the blocks? Is it the link to traditional patterns in some typology of the apartments, of the houses? Is it in materialization? Is it in how it functions? Where shall we search for these links?
I think what is a very important, you can call it tradition or aspect of housing in the Netherlands that I think is still very valid and that we should be very aware of, is the connection between the private and the public space. There has always been traditionally a very open connection. It's even that many foreigners, people who visit the country, are surprised when they walk during the evening through a city that people don't close their windows and you can look out. That is part of it. And we see it in those famous Dutch master paintings of the 17th century, that the doors of the house towards the street are always open. So that link between that we don't close ourselves off, but that the house is directly connected to the street with a door, with an open door, your own door. I think that you can see that has always played a role in housing design. And I think that's also one of the qualities of our cities, of the way we live, that we don't hide behind walls or shutters to create, let's say, also a good and safe public space in our cities. And I think that's something, we have to constantly be aware of, that a housing block or a building should not be an autonomous, closed-off thing, but it has to relate to its surroundings, connect to it. I think that's why our cities are livable places, and we have to be aware of that. I think it's also a beautiful tradition that there's this open connection.
Mm-hmm. And the big focus on the plinth, so the ground floor of the building. And
of course also mistakes were made here, and we've seen that, again talking about post-war neighborhoods, that if you fill the plinth only with storage spaces, that the public space fails. It's not considered safe anymore, people don't take care of it anymore. So that connectivity is, I think, crucial. And we can learn that from very old examples and recent examples.
And is there something that, for example, we tend to forget when it comes to the housing design? Something that was very important?
If you only think in terms of production, you tend to forget those aspects if it's only about numbers. And we made that mistake in the past. We should not make it again.
You mean the budget-driven projects? That's the big risk.
These are the new fresh students who have their first weekend here. So
the noises upstairs.
Upstairs is the big lecture hall.
Okay, so the school is not
empty. No, it
uh,
starts now. So they have a weekend now organized by the Study Association, and next week is the official introduction week of the university.
It's very good to mention that all the housing design topics are gathered in DASH magazines, the Delft Architectural Studies on Housing. This is the series devoted to residential design. And residential design, I have to admit that usually during the studies time, I also remember that it's not usually the most thrilling project to design for students. Coming back to a student topic, actually, like typical opinion is that everything was already invented, that it's a regulation-driven and budget-driven project, that the spaces are not the most exciting. If you would like to encourage the listeners, the students, or future students, like why actually the housing design might be a very exciting area to explore and to develop.
Well, that's a great question. And what I like to say to students also, to provoke them a little bit, that it's much easier to design a museum than good housing. But I absolutely believe in that. Good housing, Okay, you can say everything has been invented in housing already, but that's not true. Because I think times change and the ambitions, aspirations of people change. Also the demands change. All the sustainable issues we have to address about energy, adaptation to climate change, the growing lack of resources, so to think more circular, also in building materials. It will really change the way we have to design housing if we want to make housing that also, let's say, contributes to a good future for everyone. So I think it's the biggest challenge for architects to work on housing, and they should.
Mm-hmm. That's a great quote, actually, that the housing design might be more exciting, might be more difficult than designing a museum.
absolutely.
Yeah, perfect. Well, Dick, thank you for your time and for sharing your experience, the professional experience, and also a fascinating insight on housing design.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you really enjoyed it, and let me know what are your thoughts on housing shortage and good long-term housing solutions. Let me know if this topic really interests you and if you'd like to have more conversations like this. If you'd like to gain more information, check the links in the description of this episode. You can find me on my social media channels such as Instagram or LinkedIn under the name Architektura Powinna. And that's all what I have for you in this episode. Hope you enjoyed it and see you in the next one.